The Democratic National Committee will meet in just a few weeks to pick its next leader. Minnesota Congressman Keith Ellison and former Obama Labor Secretary Tom Perez are considered favorites for the post, and they're laying out their vision for the Democratic Party. Hundreds of thousands marched on Washington over the weekend to voice their opposition to the Trump administration and the Republican-led Congress. And Democrats are now asking how they can translate those marches into votes come 2018. Guy Cecil is in Washington. He's chairman of the Priorities USA Super PAC, which supported Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential campaign. I first want to get your thoughts on Mr. Trump's renewed claim that millions of people voted illegally. We should note that Mr. Trump's claims haven't been backed up with evidence.
Well, I think one of the challenges for journalists is finding new synonyms for the word lie. We've called them deceptions. We've called them misstatements. Finally, the New York Times today listed it as exactly what it is, and that is a lie. There is no evidence. There never has been of widespread voter fraud, despite what the majority leader said. And in fact, what we do know that there's evidence of is efforts around the country from state legislators and governors who are engaging in all sorts of voter suppression. In fact, an organization that I run, Every Citizen Counts, was engaged in litigation in North Carolina. And through that discovery process, we actually uncovered state legislators and elected officials specifically targeting African-American precincts and counties, reducing the number of early vote locations, all with the specific intention of driving down turnout. And so the real issue here is not voter fraud. It never has been. It's in fact voter suppression by Republican elected officials and activists around the country. But this is just another example of Donald Trump looking into the faces of the American people and just flat out lying to them.
So, given what you just said, as a matter of strategy, how would you advise Democrats to respond to Mr. Trump's claims?
Well, first of all, we need to be on the front lines every day and everywhere fighting against voter intimidation. We need to make sure that we are engaged in litigation, in social action, in lobbying in state legislatures. We need to hold Democratic governors and state legislatures accountable for expanding the right to vote in their state. I was very happy to see the governor of New York do that. But the fact of the matter is, when it comes to Donald Trump, we are going to have to pick and choose which fights we wage. Every day, he deceives the American people. And as we move forward, he's going to begin betraying the American people. You know, what was missed in most of the coverage of Donald Trump's first couple of days in office was actually an executive order that made it significantly more expensive for the poor and middle class Americans to access mortgages. We're going to see these types of actions that betray the people he claimed that he was going to represent through the course of the election. And part of our responsibility at Priorities is going to make sure that we're holding him accountable every single time he does it.
Well, on another issue here, we saw these demonstrations around the world over the weekend. How does the Democratic Party capitalize on that enthusiasm?
You know, obviously, for those of us who are progressive, that care about these issues, the election was incredibly dispiriting. But, you know, I've spent a lot of time over the last 5 weeks traveling around the country. I've met with local organizers and activists. I've attended church services. I've met with union presidents and organization leaders. And, you know, through all of this, I am encouraged by a renewed sense of commitment, not just on the part of elected officials or Democratic Party officials or DNC chair candidates, but on young people, on local organizers who are out there doing the important work. And so there's no question. This is just day 4 of the administration. We have a lot of work to do to organize ourselves to engage in local and state elections, something Democrats have dropped the ball on over the last 8 years. But I'm incredibly encouraged by what I saw in D.C. and around the country, a renewed sense of commitment, of local organizing, and of calling this president to account. And it's something that's going to be critical, not just on the first March day, but in every single day since, calling members of Congress, organizing local communities, inviting neighbors over to discuss what's happening in their city councils and their state legislatures. So I think we're just at the very beginning of this process, but we have, I think, a lot of reasons to be optimistic that we're seeing the rebirth of the progressive movement in this country.
Well, you put out a tweet asking which candidates for DNC chair participated in the marches. The Washington Post says only South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg did. Why did you raise that question?
Well, look, I think it's important that our elected officials and our party leaders are accountable. and all of them have talked about the importance of local organizing. I think, the two folks you mentioned, Keith Ellison and Tom Perez, have introduced a lot of good ideas about how we can bring power back to the local levels of our party, how we can organize a 50-state strategy. But there's no question that it's important that action meets words. And in this particular case, I was encouraged to see that Pete had marched in his local parade and local march, rather. And that's not the only action that can be taken. But it's important that we actually say and do things that are going to build our party from the ground up. And I think that was a good example of someone doing it.
Well, as you know, the RNC put out a report, a postmortem after Mitt Romney's loss to President Obama in 2012. If you had to write one for the DNC in 2016, what would the first 3 bullet points be?
Well, I do think it's interesting to note that the autopsy that the Republicans did called for a more open-minded and fair Republican Party that embraced immigration and Hispanic voters. And in fact, over the course of the last 4 years, we've gotten the exact opposite, an exclusionary Republican Party that has decided its path to power is to pit one group of Americans against the other. But the 3 bullet points for Democrats, I think, are clear. 1, we have to engage and invest in a 50-state strategy. 2, we need to make sure that we're paying as much attention in the next 2 years to state legislative races and governor's races as we are federal races. And number 3, we need to stay focused on answering one simple question. How do the American people hear and see when Donald Trump is betraying them? Because the fact of the matter is, many of them are not reading their local newspaper. They're not watching cable news. They're getting information online. They're getting information from their friends and neighbors. And this is something that Priorities is going to be really invested in, making sure that we are doing all we can to reach out to folks that voted for President Obama and then voted for President Trump, African-American voters who chose not to vote in this election, young people who in many cases sat out. We've got a lot of work to do to make sure we're communicating up and down the ticket in all 50 states, and that would be the primary focus if I were writing the autopsy.
Guy Cecil in Washington. Guy, thanks very much for your perspective.
Thanks for having me.